Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are today. Thank you all for joining. There's a few more people coming in and we will start this webinar momentarily. Thank you. Thank you all for joining today. This is part of our WEO Week webinar series in which we are taking the opportunity to dive into other topics that were not able to be covered for the launch of the World Energy Outlook and allow us to dive into many of the great details that we find within this year's report. I'm joined by many colleagues today who will be sharing with you some of the people and planet impacts that are assessed within this year's World Energy Outlook. This is a new area of research and analysis. The IEA continues to take on more in its publications and evaluate how things like jobs, affordability, competitiveness, investment and financing more clean energy in the emerging market and developing world all contributes to our global objectives for a healthier and more climate secure planet. So this is something that we think is crucial to the success of clean energy transitions, because if we are not having outcomes that benefit people, we will risk the continued forward progress on clean energy transition. So this is something that we think is absolutely essential to making sure that these are secure and consistent transitions in the direction of reducing emissions while providing ample energy to everyone and every business today, and also those who do not have it today, and making sure we're extending access where possible. So without further ado, I think we'll get directly to the presentation. There's a Q&A function in which we encourage you to start putting in questions as they come to you. We'll make sure we answer those all at the very end, and we'll try and answer as many as we possibly can. So please do put those in throughout the webinar, and then we'll have a Q&A opportunity at the very end there. So without further ado, I will hand it over to my colleague, Victor, who will kick us off.
Thank you very much, Dan. I would like to start this session. Sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. I would like to start this session by giving a quick overview of what's the status and what has been the evolution of some of the clean energy technologies during last years. And as you can see in the graph, solar PV capacity installations increased by 3.45 times in 2023 compared to 2019. Wind, they doubled the capacity installations in 2023. Heat pump sales increased by 30%. Electric cars sales were 6.5 higher in 2023 than 2019. So as we can see, during recent years, the clean energy technology and the clean energy economy really accelerated, and this is because of government support, but it's mainly a matter of economics, since the cost has decreased significantly during those years. And as clean energy technologies become more important, and also for the energy system and the energy markets, it's also important to track this evolution, to track what the deployment of those technologies is being. And for this purpose, we started a new publication series last March, which we call the Clean Energy Market Monitoring. And we updated this last November. And in this publication, we can see insights like the ones we show in this next slide. And we try to capture the most recent trends of selected clean energy technology. So here, for example, we can see that in the first half of 2024, solar PV installations were 36% higher than the first half of 2023. Similarly, for wind, we can observe that the first half, the installations have kept constant at the record levels of 2023. For heat pumps, we see that the sales have decreased by around 10%. And for electric cars, we see that the electric car sales have increased by around 25%. So even though we see progress in clean energy transitions and clean energy technology deployment, we still observe this very much focused in advanced economies and in China. However, we are starting to see signs that this is changing since, for example, electric cars sales double in emerging markets and developed economies, excluding China, reaching a share, electric vehicle share market of 5%, which is equivalent to the share we see in developed Asia nowadays. So even though clean energy progress is promising, unfortunately, 2023 was again a record year for energy-related CO2 emissions, which highlights that we are still far to meet climate targets. However, we can see already clean energy technology making an impact because in 2023, CO2 emissions were around 1 gigaton higher than 2019. But without the solar PV, the wind power, the nuclear power, the heat pumps, and the electric cars, those emissions would have been 3 times larger than the increase that we saw in 2023. So we can see already those technologies making an impact. And with this, I will pass the word to my colleague, Arthur Roger.
Thank you, Victor. And I would now like to talk about the short-term trends for households and on energy policies. So the energy crisis the world experienced over the past few years had severe impacts for households. As you, of course, know, energy prices skyrocketed on energy markets. And despite the fact that thanks to clean energy technologies, we kind of managed to temper this increase in energy prices. And also, despite all the government spending for households to protect them and to shield them from this increase in energy prices, we saw an increase of energy bills of 15% for households on average. So 15% is huge, it's very significant. It's especially significant for households who already struggle to make ends meet today. And just to give an example, in the European Union in 2022, during the energy crisis, it's more than 40 million households that couldn't keep their house adequately warm because of energy prices. Another big impact of the energy crisis is on energy access. So for the first time in decades, we saw the number of people without having access to electricity access increasing globally, which was very concerning. But the good news in this year World Energy Outlook is that we found that the consequences of the energy crisis are starting to subside for households, and energy prices went down on energy markets. And so that's why we saw households around the world saw a decrease on their energy bills of around 4%, which is better than the year before, but this decrease could have been higher only based on energy markets. But the main issue was that at the same time, government spending for households were rolled back. So all the support that were implementing the crisis were rolled back. So energy prices for households remained quite high for some households in certain regions. But then we also have very good news for households regarding electricity access. So the number of people without access to electricity today is back on a downward trend. So so we see the number of grid connection resuming, and we also see a real momentum behind a solar home system. So this momentum is pushed by new payment system and new business models, and we also see decreasing cost of solar PV modules and batteries. And finally, one other very good news for households is the number of energy jobs. So 2.5 million energy jobs were created in 2023, which is a 0.5 million increase compared to 2022. And this increase in energy jobs was mainly driven by the renewable sector, although some jobs were also created in the fossil fuel sector. We estimate that 2/3 of these jobs were created in the clean energy sector. I would now like to talk a bit about the state of energy policies globally. And energy regulations have seen important advances in both coverage and stringency. So now minimum energy performance standards, emission standards, bans on certain polluting technologies, and mandatory codes are now covering more than 75% of global energy related emission. And the trend is actually quite positive. This dynamic is encouraging because within the past 12 months, we saw 35 countries representing more than 1/5 of global energy-related CO2 emissions that pass new energy regulation that are meant to decrease global emissions, which is quite positive. But however, like everything is not going in one direction, and we also saw some rollback in certain regions over the past 12 months, especially on fossil fuel boiler bans, also on the sales of electric vehicles and the use of innovative coal in the power sector. So some existing policies were just postponed and some others were relaxed. But I think it's important to take a step back and to put things into perspective, because this rollback on energy policies only affected 1% of global energy-related emissions, which is relatively small compared to the 1/5 I've just mentioned for the increase in the stringency of energy policies. I would also like to talk about government spending for clean energy technologies. We also see very positive trends on this side because since 2020, it's around $2 trillion that were earmarked by governments to support clean energy technologies. And again, the trends are very positive. In 2022 and 2023, we saw governments representing more than 35% of global energy-related emission that decided to allocate more funds to support clean energy technologies. And only in 2024, it's more than 40 countries that decided to allocate around $300 billion to support clean energy. So all these positive trends for households and also on energy policies are, I think it's a relief after the energy crisis. And they are also included, of course, in our stated policy scenario in this year World Energy Outlook. And I would now like to hand over to my colleague, Daniel Crowe, to talk a bit more about the long-term trends.
Thanks very much, Arthur. So I want to talk about climate first. Since the turn of the century, the global average long-term temperature rise has doubled to around 1.3 degrees today, caused by increasing greenhouse gas emissions, mainly stemming from the energy sector. The impacts even of this level of climate change are significant. For example, the 12-month period to May 2024 saw a record-breaking 76 extreme heat events worldwide, with damaging consequences for infrastructure, healthcare services, vulnerable populations, and the natural environment. For the energy sector, a combination of heat waves and drought can reduce the effective capacity of power plants, increase transmission losses, and at the same time, drive up electricity demand for cooling. The total cost of meeting cooling demand during extreme heat events has risen from just over $10 billion each year during the 1990s to nearly $30 billion a year in the last decade. It is very likely that 2024 will be the warmest year not just in recorded history, but for the last 100,000 years, and might exceed 1.5 degrees due to the compounding effects of climate change and natural climate variability, such as the El Niño cycle. However, I think it's important to remember that the 1.5 degree threshold, as set out in the Paris Agreement, applies to the underlying long-term warming trend rather than a single year. Even if the temperature rise exceeds 1.5 degrees for a short period, the temperature rise can be brought back down below 1.5 degrees with concerted long-term action. Looking ahead, our scenarios portray very different climate futures. In the steppes, the temperature rise exceeds 2 degrees just after 2050 and reaches about 2.4 degrees in 2100. In the NZE scenario, rapid cuts in CO2 emissions, but also crucially, a 75% reduction in energy-related methane emissions by 2030, hold the temperature rise below 1.6 degrees before falling back to below 1.5 degrees by 2100. But while the science is clear that warming is happening and that it's caused by us, the exact extent of how much future warming is in store is less clear. As shown by the shaded region in the figure, there is about a 30% chance of warming above 2.6 degrees in the steppes. With these levels of risk, every 1/10 of a degree matters, and countries around the world need to bring emissions down to net zero as soon as possible to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. As touched on before, around 750 million people lack electricity access, and just over 2 billion lack access to clean cooking. Around half of people without access to clean cooking and 80% of those without access to electricity live in sub-Saharan Africa. Looking ahead, first on electricity access, this is back on an upward trend after a falling back during COVID, but around 650 million people are still projected to lack access to electricity in 2030 in the steppes. This represents a slight improvement compared to the WIO23 report last year, thanks to policy momentum and technological improvements, but remains significantly short of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal of achieving universal access by 2030. While technological improvements and innovative models are helping to address the electricity access issue, public interventions and targeted incentives are required if 120 million people are to gain access each year, as is required to achieve the SDG 7.1 goal of universal access by 2030. Most of the progress needs to take place in sub-Saharan Africa, where around 7% of the population has to gain access each year to get back on track. This pace of annual progress is not unprecedented, with comparable and higher percentages having been achieved in the past in Bangladesh, Kenya, Ghana, Rwanda, and India. But this remains challenging. As for clean cooking, the main obstacles to further progress are affordability and limited clean cooking policies and programs. Countries that have recently implemented or strengthened clean cooking policies have often seen rapid progress, particularly in urban and peri-urban areas. Around 630 million people without access today live in countries where new and improved government initiatives and regulatory frameworks have been introduced in the past couple of years. While this has improved the outlook for clean cooking since WIO 2023, around 1.7 billion people still lack access to clean cooking by 2030 in the steppes. To achieve universal access by 2030, around $55 billion in upfront investment is needed each year, of which around 10 billion annually is for clean cooking. Public and concessional finance has a crucial role to improve affordability and reduce perceived risks for private investors through programs and initiatives such as the World Bank and African Development Bank commitment to provide 300 million people in Africa with access to electricity by 2030. Exposure to air pollution causes more than 17,000 premature deaths every day, making it deadlier than smoking or obesity. Around 40% of these deaths come from breathing smoky air indoors, primarily associated with lack of access to clean cooking, and the remainder from exposure to ambient air pollution. Over 99% of people exposed to heavily polluted air live in emerging market and developing economies, and more than 90% of premature deaths occur there. There are also dramatic economic costs from air pollution associated with productivity losses, as well as direct healthcare costs, and these can exceed 10% of GDP in some developing economies. In the steppes by 2030, there is little change to the number of people dying annually from air pollution, but the causes of these deaths changes. Around 600,000 fewer deaths come from exposure to household air pollution, largely due to progress on clean cooking access. But there are around 400,000 additional deaths from ambient air pollution, mainly as a result of population growth and urbanization. By contrast, in the NZE scenario, the number of people exposed to high concentrations of air pollution declines dramatically from current levels. This is mainly due to much faster progress on clean cooking, where associated premature deaths are cut by over 80% in 2030, but also from reduced emissions from electricity generation, from industry, and in particular the rapid growth in EVs, which cut ambient air pollution emissions by over 60% by 2030 compared to today. And now I will hand over to the next presenter.
What was highlighted so far also had significant implications for investment and the prospect of an orderly transition. What you see on the screen right now is the trend for fossil fuel spending. We've spoken mostly about clean energy so far, but this is what investment in fossil fuels look like, and it sits at about $1 trillion per year. This trend is fairly stable since 2014. We're roughly at the levels that we were seeing in 2014. But what we saw in the past is that those trends in the stated policy scenario implied a need to increase fossil fuel spending to meet to meet the outlook for a rising oil demand in the future. But now, if you've attended other parts of the series of webinars, you'll see that the demand for oil, the outlook for the demand for oil is now lower, and we have a more dynamic clean energy overview. And so we don't see, even in the STEP scenario, we don't see any case for increase in spending in fossil fuels. The end of this growth of spending in fossil fuels does not mean that there is an end in fossil fuel spending at all. We still have some, but in our analysis, we undercut the argument for any increase in that spending. And of course, we have to focus too on the glaring risks for the climate that were highlighted just a few seconds ago. So we need to accelerate the momentum on investment on the clean energy side. The clean energy investment has been growing quite rapidly in recent years, plus 40% since 2020. And we are set for this to rise to well above 2.5, almost 3 trillion by 2030 and 2035 in the STEP scenario. But we do need to see this doubling again if we want to stay on track, or to be put on track to reach net zero emissions in the energy sector by 2050. And it's also very important to make sure that those two elements, a decrease of spending in fossil fuel and an increase in spending in clean energy, happen in a synchronized manner. If we cut the investment in fossil fuels too early or without investing in clean energy, then the world might see higher prices and a less just, fair, and affordable energy transitions. And the positive trend that we've seen on clean energy investments also comes with a major regional imbalance in the capital flows. And this really puts at risk the prospects of meeting the climate goal in an equitable and orderly way. So if we look at what happens in advanced economies in China, together they account for 85% of all clean energy investment today. And the share of the other developing countries has fallen back in recent years and sits at around 15% of the total clean energy investment. And even though those economies account for 2/3 of the global population and 1/3 of global GDP. And this misalignment in spending is one of the major concerns that we highlight in the World Energy Outlook, especially given that the demand for energy services in those developing countries will inevitably grow in the future to meet the development and the energy service and the rising standards of living. So therefore, we need to see a growth in investment in clean energy projects in all parts of the world, but the picture is not the same everywhere when we look at our scenario. For instance, in advanced economies and China, investment doubles from today's level, from 2023 levels, to 2035 in the net zero scenario. This is a large number, but it's not infeasible. And if we look at the picture for other developing economies outside China, the required increase is more than 6 times the amount invested in 2023. The current policy environment in many of these countries remain a major barrier to accelerating the shift to clean energy. And there are other barriers preventing investment happening at scale, namely the high cost of capital and the lack of affordable long-term financing for clean energy projects.
Now, energy transitions are about improving outcomes for people. So the way that the energy transition affects households is essential to the prospect for successful change. Currently, on average, the total household expenditure, including energy and transport, is around $4,000 per year per household in advanced economies and $700 per year in emerging markets and developing economies. In advanced economies, households start to see lower energy bills in 1.5 degrees pathway compared with today's policy setting. And this is due to the investment into heat pumps, building retrofits, EVs that pay dividends relatively quickly. And wholesale prices, fuel prices that have been driven lower by reduced demand. In emerging markets and developing economies, instead, household energy expenditure is less linear. It faces an initial period of higher energy bills in the NZD scenario than in steps. As access to modern energy increases, fossil fuels are gradually phased out and CO2 prices are introduced. Nevertheless, in the long term, households' energy expenditure decreases rapidly in the NZD scenario, dropping by more than 25% relative to steps by 2050. But we are starting from a very challenging point. The global energy crisis was a stark reminder of the importance of energy reliability and affordability. And in this year, World Energy Outlook, we did a detailed analysis of household energy use and expenditures by income group and by type of economy. And we found significant inequalities in today's energy system. The huge increases in energy prices did not fall evenly across income groups. Low income groups were hit the hardest. In advanced economies, the poorest 10% of households spend to 1/4 of their disposable income on residential energy and transport fuels, even though they consume around half as much of these fuels as the richest 10%. In emerging economies, there is an even larger disparity across income groups, with the poorest grouping consuming 1/4 that of the richest. And you can also see that they do not spend much of their income on energy. At first sight, it might look like a positive indicator, but in reality, the reason for this is that the energy needs among the poorest houses are often not met. And when they are met, it's often with firewood and other biomass that is collected. So there is not a monetary transaction and therefore not accounted in our expenditure metrics. So we see that the average prices of energy expenditure are declining, but there is a political challenge, which is making sure that these structural inequalities among income groups are fixed and the most vulnerable houses are protected. A final key consideration is employment. Energy sector is a major employer, and clean energy transition is set to boost energy employment significantly. Job growth associated with clean energy more than outweighs losses in fossil fuels in all IEA scenarios, with over 6 million jobs created under current policies and over 15 million on the path to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Under current policies, the world is set to add nearly 10 million clean energy jobs by 2030. And this number rises to a staggering 30 million new clean energy jobs in a scenario aligned with 1.5 degrees of warming. However, the limited supply of skilled energy labor is emerging as a bottleneck to the transition, exacerbated by the large share of high-skilled workers needed compared to the economy-wide average. And the growing clean energy sector takes place alongside declining employment in fossil fuel sector. Under current policies, we estimate that around 3.5 million jobs related to fossil fuels are at risk of redundancy this decade, and this figure rises to over 14.5 million in a net zero aligned pathway. Upskilling these existing energy workers in the fossil fuel sector who face redundancy risk can help minimize the threat of skilled labor shortages in the clean energy sector, especially as around half of fossil fuel workers already possess the skills and the specialization needed to fill clean energy roles. So it will require less time to fill the needs or the missing gaps to fill these clean energy roles. Energy jobs growth presents one of the greatest opportunities for policymakers to rally public support for the energy transition, and policies can be designed in a way that raises working standards and draws new and diverse people into energy. And with this, I hand over the word back to Dan.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm also double shifting as IT person today, so let me fix the camera and then we'll enter the Q&A. Thank you to those of you who've already entered your questions. We'll be with you momentarily. Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for your attendance today, and thank you to the presenters for their excellent work. We already have a few Q&As in the box, but before we head to that, I also wanted to mention that we had we'll take a quick second later today to talk about a special report that the IEA did for the G20, which was a financing roadmap for solving the challenges and not having enough critical investment in EMDs, and how do we address some of those challenges. So the head of our unit, investment unit, Cecilia Tam, will be joining us. She had a conflicting meeting, but we'll be able to share a little bit about that report momentarily. So first, we had some questions specifically around on gender and the amount of data the IEA has that is gender disaggregated. So maybe I can start in on this question first, and where we have this. So the IEA has a new initiative that's really focused on how do we bring and mainstream a lot of gender components into our work. Much of this is already at play today in some of the data we have on energy employment, for instance, where we really look at by different energy sector, what share of the current workforce is women, and where do we see needs for improvement, which in particular, we did a deep dive this year looking at the importance of vocational skills and how to bring better gender diversity into key vocational occupations like electricians, like construction workers, and that these are some of the key segments that we see this imbalance deriving from because they take a disproportionate share of energy workers today. So this is one way, but we also look at in terms of access to finance, particularly in emerging market and developing economies, but we also look at the impacts on a gender basis. And I think our work in clean cooking in particular has been a way in which we've been able to herald the importance of this from a gender representation perspective, and also how do we make sure the clean energy transition directly accrues benefits to women. But it's an area the IEA continues to try to improve on, and we welcome recommendations on where else we can broaden that focus and make sure that's mainstreamed in all aspects of our work. So, and I have one other question that I think is very easy to answer. Yes, this session will be publicly available online afterwards on our website, as well as also on YouTube. Before I go to more Q&A, and please continue to ask questions there, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague Cecilia Tam, who has led this very important flagship report for this year's G20 on financing clean energy transitions in developing economies. So Cecilia, over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Dan. So in terms of the work that we did on financing clean energy and developing economies for the Brazilian G20 presidency, this work provided a very important action plan that identified priority actions that could be implemented by the developing countries themselves to improve planning and policy frameworks to enable much more investment into critical clean energy technologies in the energy sector. It also helped to, I think, unpack the large amounts of investment necessary for transition. So our analysis identified that about 1.8 trillion would need to be invested every year by 2035 in developing economies other than China if we were to meet the net zero goals. This is more than a six-fold increase compared to current levels of spending on clean energy in this region. And the Roadmap Action Plan basically unpacked these investment levels into more digestible amounts, really quantifying and identifying those types of investments that would be led by the private sector, those that required public-private support through facilitated interventions, really focused around different international support aimed at helping to de-risk projects, helping to lower the very high cost of capital, which is one of the single largest barriers to enabling more investments into the sector. And then finally, it identified a bucket of investment that we felt needed to be publicly driven, either because these are in sectors or technologies that were still nascent, or in countries with high sort of risks because of conflict issues, or very least developing countries where a number of these projects currently are not really meeting commercial levels of project adjusted risk. So the roadmap that I invite you all to take a look at highlights a number of priority interventions that could be implemented by the international community, as well as ways of strengthening the policy frameworks in countries to be able to better manage some of the prevailing risks that investors see in investments, as well as highlighting a number of innovative financing mechanisms, de-risking mechanisms that can really help to improve the risk-adjusted return levels to a level that we can see much more mobilization of private capital, helping to reach that scale of investment necessary, particularly from the commercial sector.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. And I really encourage everyone to look at this report. I think it was really fundamental for some of the conversations around the new quantified collective goal for climate finance at COP this year. So I have another question here that is specific to the 1.5 degree scenario on the net zero. So an increasing number of climate scientists are saying that 1.5 is no longer a viable target. What is the IEA's stance on that, and how does that affect the net zero scenario? Maybe I hand this over to Daniel Crowe.
Thanks, Daniel. So this is a fascinating and very topical question. I think part of the answer, and it's very important to bear in mind, is what I had up in my slide. So this year, we're likely to see temperatures exceeding 1.5 degrees. I think most of the estimates are showing that we're on track for that. However, the Paris Agreement is actually based on a much longer term target, often a 20-year rolling average. And these annual natural variability fluctuations are not the thing that the agreement is based on. And so, you know, there is still room. We're currently at around 1.3 degrees, and so we've still got, you know, a bit of room left. I think the key point here is the word overshoot. So when the IPCC talks about 1.5 degree pathways, it actually separates them into limited or no overshoot pathways, and they tend to stay below 1.6 degrees, and high overshoot pathways, which go above 1.6 degrees. Now, I think pathways that are actually going to limit the temperature all through the century to below 1.5 degrees are pretty much off the table now. I don't think any viable pathway really exists anymore which delivers that. But, you know, pathways which limit the temperature rise to below 1.6 degrees and then come back down to 1.5 degrees, they do still exist. And in fact, our own NZE pathway, we've just done the analysis on this using a climate model, shows that it's still possible to bring the temperature rise back down and to avoid the worst excesses of temperature rise. So it's definitely technically feasible. Looking ahead, I think that the 1.5 degree goal, which remember is the most stringent part of the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement sets out a range of ambition on temperature rise. I think the 1.5 degree goal will still be useful, particularly as it aligns countries on the notion that they have to get to net zero around mid-century. So there's a sort of time element that's particularly useful. But I think we will increasingly see pathways which approach 1.5 degrees from above by using carbon dioxide removal technologies, rather than ones that limit it to 1.5 degrees from below. But it's certainly still viable, and I think as a headline goal, it will remain so for the next few years.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Daniel. I have another question on affordability. So this recalls the slide that I think Deanna was presenting that sort of indicated that in the near term, EMDs would see a higher amount of energy needing to be expended by households in a net zero scenario, even though in the longer term it'd be lower. The question is, why would EMDs choose that pathway? And is it possible to slow down fossil fuel phase out and the introduction of CO2 prices? How do they manage that at the same time to make sure that this is a attractive pathway for them? So Deanna, over to you.
Thanks, Daniel. This is a very good question, but it's actually very tricky because it is really important that we have a timely phase out of fossil fuels and that introduction of CO2 prices as fast as possible to send the necessary cost and price signals to the energy system to encourage that electrification and that decarbonization in the long run. Of course, it's therefore really important to design the right framework to protect the most vulnerable households and the poorest income group.
Perfect. Thank you so much. There is another one here that is which fossil fuel jobs are the easiest to transition to what clean energy roles? Maybe I'll tackle this one. So we have a publication called the World Energy Employment Report that came out earlier this month that looks at some of these pathways and which ones make most sense. And I think the first thing to say is the energy to energy pathway, I think, is very attractive from an intellectual perspective, but not necessarily how it plays out in reality, especially in emerging markets and developing economies, where we actually see many retired coal workers, for instance, in China, where they've halved the number of people working in coal, largely due to automation in the last decade. Many of these workers go to other careers, things in construction, things in running a restaurant, moving to different cities, et cetera. So the pathways are quite different depending on the skill level. That said, we did a survey for a part of that study, which indicated that most energy companies said that they would rather hire within the energy sector, even if it's an unrelated portion of the energy sector, before turning outside of that, because the general familiarity with energy sector terminology, investment needs, et cetera, was more attractive to them in terms of a skilling basis. So from our estimate, as Deanna said in that slide, 50% of those occupations that we see at risk in the next 10 years could transition to other parts of the energy sector quite easily. Some of these pathways are miners from coal into critical mineral mining. Others are electricians that may be working on one part of the power system, upskilling to high voltage electrician, et cetera. And some of these different skilling pathways there. Geothermal is another great opportunity for oil and gas into geothermal. We have a forthcoming future of geothermal report that will be coming out, I think in the next few months. So we encourage you to look at that and talks about some of the skilling applications there as well. Maybe there's a question on ratios between government spending and private capital. I'm not sure between the two of you who wants to answer it, but I'll hand it over to Tanguy, and Cecilia can maybe add. But there's questions there, which is what is the ratio of government to private capital that needs to be utilized? And also how does that change regionally? There's also a specific question on, how much more capital do you need to throw at it to make sure there's quick entry for really urgent projects that are needed? And how does that change also for longer term infrastructure projects like transmission substations, which have a much longer lead time? So Tanguy, over to you, and Cecilia as well.
Good. So on the question about the ratio between public and private spending, so the situation is obviously not the same depending on which region we're looking at. But overall, worldwide today, we estimate that about 45% of the energy investment is made by private firms, about 35% by states and quasi-state enterprise, so state-owned entities, and 20% by households. And so that's the investment today. The picture, obviously, in the future moves more towards an increasing role for the private sector financing. If we look at the sources of I just mentioned investment, but if we look at who is financing this investment, there we see a very different picture depending on where we look. And so there is a huge role to play for commercial financing, which is already the case in advanced economies. But we see that rising in China and other emerging and developing economies, where currently there is more public investment happening. And we also need to highlight some of the vital role that development finance institutions have to play in financing the energy transition in the developing world, and especially they have a role in catalyzing the finance and attract more finance in those higher risk countries and technologies. In terms of financing of the outlook for financing projects, depending on their types, I would say that the net zero scenario takes this into account. And if you look at the NZE when the financing happens in the net zero scenario, you have urgent financing needed to decarbonize the power sector. The power sector is the first to decarbonize around the world. So you have urgent financing in renewables that we're seeing already in wind and solar. We do need to see much more. I think it's a doubling on top of my head, but I would need to come back to you on this side. But much more investment on grids and infrastructure, investment in the flexibility of the power system, storage, and batteries. And then once the electricity sector is fully decarbonized, then you see a pickup in investment in other sectors, such as, for instance, energy efficiency in emerging markets and developing economies. It happens earlier on in advanced economies, but you have more of that happening once you have a decarbonized power system around the world. Perfect.
Thanks so much, Tanguy. Did you want to add anything? Excellent. So there's another question here, which is what kind of policies should be employed in developing countries to make sure they're able to afford the expenses that climate change brings along with it. So I think there's maybe this is a packed question here, but I think there's maybe three elements that we'd want to talk to on this. One is on the general affordability portion of this, particularly in terms of access and general energy affordability, energy poverty. Maybe I'll turn that first portion over to Diana, and Arturo can complement on that. The second piece on that, I think, is how do we help these people finance that? And maybe I can turn that over to you, Cecilia. So I think we'll take those two. I think there's also a climate resilience question that I'm also happy to put a little cap on as well. So maybe Diana first.
Yes, so in terms of affordability for the household component, there are many options, but some of the resources that are coming from these incremental prices, such as the fact that the subsidies before used in fossil fuels are going to be available, and also the resources coming from CO2 taxes are going to be available. The recommendation is to better use these resources in a smart manner way to redirect that to the low income or more vulnerable houses. This can be done directly, reflecting this into the energy bill, for instance, and the final stage. So we make sure that we do not, we do not subsidize fossil fuels along the way, or we encourage the right investment options or the investment decisions.
And maybe I would add on the fossil fuel subsidy side. I think we have to acknowledge that today these fossil fuel subsidies are a huge burden for these emerging market and developing economies, especially because of the fossil fuel price volatility as we experienced during the energy crisis. So when the energy prices and fossil fuel prices were skyrocketing on energy markets, the public spending were also skyrocketing for these subsidies. So it was, I think, a huge burden on public finances. And so we saw also an opportunity if these countries stop subsidizing these fossil fuels to have more breathing space and to have the opportunity to support households with other subsidies in the transition. And we, I think, want to make the point that these subsidies have to be as targeted as possible towards low-income households.
Thank you. Maybe Cecilia, over to the consumer finance portion.
Thanks very much. I think also just complementing what Diana had mentioned, that instead of having subsidies focused on the price of the fuels, we've seen based on country experience that it's much more impactful to provide particular incomes to pay for any impacts on higher fuels than subsidizing the prices, because you're not setting the right signals in terms of enabling more efficiency if energy prices are too low. On the consumer finance side, I think targeted interventions that can allow consumers to pay for higher costs, as was mentioned, is a much more impactful way to address aspects of affordability in the longer term.
Perfect. Completely agree there. And maybe the last piece we want to add is Daniel had presented an important and new finding from this year's World Energy Outlook, which is some of the impacts already that we're seeing in terms of extreme weather and the impacts of climate change on the cost of provision of reliable and secure energy. So we found that 30 billion more is being spent in our energy system based alone on just the increase in heat waves and the AC usage induced by that, as well as also the decrease in hydro and needing to compensate with more expensive peaking fuel generation to compensate for that lower output. And obviously these are ones that are very much top of mind this year with the number of heat waves and also very devastating hydro shortages that we're seeing in places like Ecuador and Zambia right now. So this is something the IEA is going to continue to look into more, recognizing it is a rising impact for, especially in emerging market and developing economies, a rising pain point that will continue to get more expensive for advancing their energy system. And we'll be discussing this at the Future of Energy Security conference that the IEA is hosting with the UK government in April. So we have another question on which one to jump to? Sorry, we dove into that one, and we had a lot more. So thank you guys for the active dialogue here. Maybe the next one is, what changes in network policy or regulation do you think are needed to deliver net zero? So I'm assuming this is electricity network policy and regulation. So I think this one I'll start and see if anyone else has to add, but really, this is going to be something that's very unique to each individual setting. You can already see it in how different electricity system rules are evolving, particularly the market-based systems, and what are the new products that they're offering in terms of ancillary services to be able to make sure they're getting the right kinds of flexibility that each grid needs. And this has a unique flavor depending on exactly how that industry is regulated, the expected returns that are needed from these to attract investors in each of these different environments. So that said, with the big caveat that this varies drastically, and we can go into some of the success stories and where we're seeing that progress. But I think the big challenge that a lot of places are facing is we know we need more investment in grids, we need more investment in secure, giving a sense of security to people who are developing renewable projects, that they are going to be able to sell their energy at a viable price point, and also be able to get a secure revenue stream and a consistent output and utilization and not having high curtailment. So with this sort of macro environment, you know that you're going to have to be offering a substantial amount of returns. And this historically in some markets have been linked to the direct market signals. And I think there's some calls for how do we decouple that? How do we really think that we're sending the long-term investment signal and then really focusing markets on the near-term responsiveness needed to get the flexibility for integration? But there's also other calls for thinking in systems that do not have markets today. How do you make sure that your returns on investment are competitive in a global investment landscape, and you're able to bring in some of that private capital that will be essential to build some of the kit is required here. So is there any other additions that people want to make to that?
Well, I would just like to echo the importance on grids, because when we look at targets, for example, of tripling renewable capacity is not what we need. We need generation out of this capacity, and without investment in grids, in flexibility, in storage, we can reach this tripling of capacity of renewables that we are almost on target nowadays. But we need all this supporting infrastructure within the energy system to actually convert all this capacity into electricity generation, which is what matters in the end.
Yeah. Just maybe to give a number on this that was published in this year World Energy Outlook. So today, for each dollar spent on renewables, we only spend 60 cents on grids and storage, which is not enough. And I think we would need to reach parity. And so $1 on renewables means $1 on grids if we want this new capacity to be turned into generation.
Very excellent point there. This also dovetails with one other question we have here, which is around the globe, various countries have adopted different ways to accommodate and integrate renewables. According to your data and expertise, which ones serve as a role model in this regard? Again, I think this is sort of, not necessarily having the highest share of variable renewables is always the best indicator of which country has the most successful model. But I think some of the examples that are sticking out right now, obviously we see some of the examples in places like Australia and Texas, where you're already having pretty small grids that have a high penetration of solar and wind, and how those grids are managing on their own on that, and some unique approaches there. And I think this is also an important thing to caveat, is sometimes those who are feeling the most pain points in terms of maintaining electrical security because of these are the ones that are learning the most and finding the most unique examples. I would also say some of the market reforms that are ongoing in China right now have been an interesting way to sort of bridge the gap between market-based system and a more centrally planned system that's driven by state and enterprise targets for investment. And that some of these markets, and particularly the introduction of flexibility products and inter-provincial exchanges, these have really helped to improve the flexibility and integrate renewables. So we are almost at time, but I have maybe one other question to field here. One, which is, can we highlight some of the ongoing support that's coming from different parts of the world to increase capital flows to EMDEs? And how do we need to shift away from a reliance on a public or government-funded approach, given that there's limited fiscal space for many of these countries? And how do we make sure that those international efforts are helping with the private sector? So I think this one's coming to you, Cecilia, so you'll close us out.
All right, thanks very much, Dan, for that final question. It's a very important issue to look at because, as we've highlighted in, I think, our presentation today, when we're looking at the pace of global energy transitions, it's really in the least developed countries, in some of the smaller emerging markets, where we are really furthest behind. There is a tremendous amount of international effort going to support increasing the availability of capital to emerging and developing countries. And it's, what we're seeing is very encouraging in the sense that it's not just about providing capital to these markets, but also work surrounding how can we improve the policy frameworks, the enabling environments for these countries to unlock more investments, both internationally, but very importantly, domestically. Because if you look at, one of the leading reasons of the very high cost of capital for investments in clean energy in emerging and developing countries, many of those are macro-related risks, the very high cost of currency hedging, because a lot of this finance internationally comes in hard currencies, but a lot of the revenues are based in local currency. So I think what we are seeing being led by different developed or donor countries and many of the DFIs are really encouraging in the sense that there is a shift and a recognition that we need to focus much more on strengthening policy environments, so enabling more investments to happen directed by the private sector because projects are attractive, and secondly, a big push towards also focusing on de-risking projects. So many of these projects that are being developed are what we would term as near bankable, meaning that there are strong project economics, but still certain risks, some of them are perceived, some of them are real, are still holding back these projects from being able to reach financial close. And a lot of the interventions we see through different de-risking products, guarantee schemes, insurance products, and such are working towards helping to unlock more private capital, because it's clear that with limited fiscal pace of many of the least developed countries, we need to really enable much more private capital investment, and this will really only happen if we can get that right sort of level of risk-adjusted returns, because as we know, commercial and private capital are rent-seeking sources of capital, but there's a lot that can be done to better manage and address both real and perceived risks, including through enhancing data transparency, something that the IEA sort of prides itself on, its sort of data-driven analysis. So there is quite a lot of efforts going on across not just the policy, but also the lending space, as well as on the capacity building front to enable developing countries to really lead in the transition and ensure that those benefits are passed on to domestic entrepreneurs as well as to their own financial sector through domestic savings.
Perfect. I'm going to tack on one extra question that was related. How can the South African G20 presidency build upon the work done for the Brazilian G20 presidency? What would you say after doing this report is the next steps here?
It's really about, I think, now that we have the roadmap action plan, it's going to be a focus on taking forward some of those actions, whether that's messages that were developed around strengthening the planning capacities of countries, because obviously we need to have strong investment plans to set the right signals for investment. That's partially also by continuing to build local capacity through that work, as well as under the South African G20 presidency to advance on some of the finance track discussions around strengthening the multilateral finance framework as well, and allowing and encouraging the DFIs to really take on more risks, because again we come back to this discussion around better managing real and perceived risks in developing projects, and that very high cost of capital, which is a discussion again about risk, is really what is, I think, creating the biggest barrier towards scaling up investments in emerging and developing countries.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you all for the vibrant set of questions here. I think we had a good time answering those. We encourage you to continue to look into the World Energy Outlook. There's a lot of great content there that we talked about today in a lot more detail than we were able to cover, but also some of these other reports that were mentioned, the G20 roadmap, the World Energy Employment Report, the COP28 implementation paper that we had that came out in September as well. So continue to look to the IEA and the Clean Tech Monitor, that I think we'll have an update early next year as well. So continue to look to us for all of your clean energy transition data and tracking needs. Maybe not all, but happy to look and hear from you guys as well, what else we can take on, and we continue to track this space with Ernest. So thank you guys for tuning in, and this will be online shortly. Cheers.